Welcome to Friend or Foe, the series where we pick apart the characters from some of our favorite games to figure out who is a friend, someone we don't need to worry will stab us in the back, and who is a foe, someone who would intentionally bring harm to the group if given the chance. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're saddling up our horse and riding west to talk about the namesake of one of the roughest gangs the Wild West has to offer, Dutch Van der Linde from Red Dead Redemption 2. As always, you can find a link in the description to a playlist for this series for those long nights where you just want to sit back, relax, and listen to a bunch of breakdowns all at once. Before we get started, we will only be discussing Dutch from the viewpoint of the main story of Red Dead Redemption 2, as that is where we get to really see the bulk of who he is. I would like to break down the first Red Dead Redemption game at some point, and when that happens, we'll discuss Dutch as we see him there. Dutch Van der Linde is the leader of the Van der Linde gang, one of the last outlaw gangs in a dying West at the turn of the 20th century. He's charismatic, well-read, and considers himself a kind of philosopher. He was born in the mid-1850s and became an outlaw sometime in his 20s after losing his father during the Civil War and leaving his mother, whom he fought with constantly, on her own. At some point in the 1870s, Dutch met a man by the name of Hosea Matthews, and the two found common ground in their attempts to con each other. Not long after, Dutch and Hosea would form the bedrock of what would become the Van der Linde gang, picking up a number of members along the way, including a pair of teens, Arthur Morgan and John Marston, whom Dutch would come to call sons. The gang would rob their way across the country, focusing mainly on helping the less fortunate and taking what they could from the wealthy and powerful. This almost altruistic way of doing things wouldn't last though, as Dutch realized over time that his attempts to change the world and make it a better place were failing. In 1899, the Van der Linde gang was in the town of Blackwater in the state of West Elizabeth when the attempted robbery of a ferry would blow up in Dutch's face and begin the downfall of his gang and their way of life. Details about what exactly went down on the ferry are sparse, but what is known is that Dutch killed a girl named Heidi McCourt when the Pinkerton Detective Agency showed up unexpectedly, and several members of the gang were killed or captured as they escaped the town in the chaos. Those who made it out sought refuge in the abandoned mountain town of Coulter, and that is where we find them as the game gets started. Dutch is rallying the group as they are trying not to freeze to death. And this is the first instance of many where we'll see him using his charisma to correct his own errors. Jumping ahead a bit, Dutch tends to use these kind of speeches to great effect in the first few chapters of the game. In this instance, they're in the mountains and have lost several members, including a man named Davy who happens to be lying on a table just feet away. And it's all because of a decision that Dutch made to rob the ferry in Blackwater. We find out in Chapter 2 that Arthur and Hosea were onto something that might have been more lucrative and safer overall when Dutch ruined it with his failed robbery. And as the game progresses, this will become a pattern. Things start to look like they're getting better, Dutch makes a bad decision, and things get worse. But let's get back to following the story before we get too far ahead of ourselves. Dutch does go back out in the weather with Arthur here to search for John and Micah, who were sent ahead to scout. And he should be given credit for that, as it appears, especially early on, that he does really care about the gang. He could have easily instructed someone else to go while he stayed back and tried to get warm. But he took the initiative to go out himself, and I think that is really a big part of what makes the gang so loyal to him. He's willing to get his hands dirty and jump in, and he's often on the front lines of some of the toughest things that they go through. But the thing I really want to focus on here in Chapter 1 actually comes after all of this intro stuff. Dutch's rival, Colm O'Driscoll, and his gang are in the mountains as well. And during a mission where we get the chance to attack and rob their camp, we recover a set of plans to rob a train owned by a man named Leviticus Cornwall. Cornwall is a railroad magnate, akin to someone like William Vanderbilt or Jay Gould from the late 19th century in the real world. He's not someone the gang should really be messing with, especially after what happened in Blackwater, and Hosea takes the time to point this out to Dutch, who doesn't really seem to care. And it's that little bit that rounds out Dutch and tells us what we can expect out of him through the course of the story. It's one thing to be hard-headed and stubborn, to say that you want to do something that most people think can't or shouldn't be done, but it's something else entirely to put yourself or others at risk unnecessarily. What Dutch does when he decides to rob Cornwall's train is to put the people he says he cares about at risk when the best move would be for them to do nothing. All he had to do was get them down out of the mountains, wait for the heat to die down, and then send someone into Blackwater for the money they left behind and head back west. Instead, he winds up leading them into a robbery that, alongside the ferry job, will wind up sealing the fate of everyone in the gang in the course of only a few months. So, we've got a charismatic leader who actually gets involved in things and leads from the front, and who is prone to making bad decisions that get people killed. What could possibly go wrong? The train robbery goes off with only a slight hiccup, and getting into Chapter 2, there is some hope in the camp that things will begin to get better. Even with the heat on them, at this point it would have still been somewhat possible to right the ship if not for Dutch showing his face in the small town of Valentine one too many times. He's a wanted man, with an extremely high bounty on his head, who is wanted dead or alive nationwide. The last thing he should be doing is showing his face in public anywhere at all, but especially in town. While word did take some time to travel in 1899, word about fugitives with big prices on their heads moved just a little faster as everyone wanted to collect that sweet money. His face might not have been known within a couple of days in the area, but it sure would have been easy to spot. And his willingness to go out in public winds up biting them all as Leviticus Cornwall shows up in person outside a bar that Dutch is drinking in to call the gang leader out. And they wind up in another shootout as Cornwall's men try like hell to take Dutch out. That's the second massacre-style exit the gang has had, as we know Blackwater had a similar fight, and now we're starting to see a pattern emerge where Dutch is concerned. And that pattern doesn't get any better as we move into chapters 3 or 4, as both end with shootouts as well, in Rhodes and Saint Denis respectively. Starting with Chapter 3, Rhodes is a muggy town in the southern state of Lemoyne, where groups of men who can't get over losing the Civil War roam about and try to relive their glory days. This probably works to agitate Dutch, as his father was killed by Confederate soldiers in the war, and he's at least partly looking forward to any revenge that he can get. Some of that revenge comes by way of taking advantage of the two biggest families in Rhodes, the Greys and the Braithwaites. As soon as he learns about these feuding hillbilly families, he's looking for ways to get in the middle of their endless fight, mostly for his own gain, but also to further what he sees as the gang's prospects of making their way to freedom on some island paradise. At this point in the story, he's starting to shift his goals, and he's starting to show even more eccentric tendencies as he ingratiates himself with the Grey family, acting as a deputy for Sheriff Grey alongside Arthur and Bill. If that seems like he's pushing his luck just a bit too far, that's because he is. Even as backwards as these two families are, it's likely they'll realize sooner or later that they are being played. It's also highly likely that Sheriff Gray will be informed at some point of the outlaw being hunted by the Pinkerton Detective Agency, with bounty posters and hunters making their way east following sightings of the Van der Linde gang members. In Dutch's mind, they'll only be in Rhodes long enough to rob the families, and they'll be out before too much trouble is caused. But like everything else he comes up with, that idea is nothing more than a fantasy. He pushed his luck in Valentine, and he's pushing it beyond its limit here as well. The gang is able to get a foot in the door of both families' houses, but the whole thing comes crashing down as the Grays try to kill off several members of the gang in a shootout in Rhodes, and the Braithwaites kidnap John Marston's son, a young boy everyone in the gang cares deeply about. To make matters worse, Agent Milton from the Pinkerton Detective Agency shows up in the camp to try and arrest Dutch, with an offer of freedom for everyone else in the gang on the table. Now, if Dutch was truly looking out for the best interest of the gang, he would turn himself in right then and there, and give the rest of them the chance to escape. They've been seeking freedom, and the walls of the law have been closing in on them for some time. This would be their best chance to get out of the life and save themselves from the gallows, and all it would take would be for Dutch to go with Agent Milton. But either he doesn't really care about the gang going free and isn't willing to sacrifice himself for the rest of them, or he doesn't believe Agent Milton, because even though he pretends like he is willing to go with them, he lets the gang draw their guns and come to his defense. If he really wanted to do the right thing, he would have told them to put their guns down, and he would have gone with the agents. And that shows a bit of his underlying character. He's someone who wants the power and control that comes along with being a leader, but he doesn't want to do the hard things that come with that role. As the gang moves into Chapter 4, we see more of this as they move to a new camp, Shady Belle, and head for the first time into the big city of Saint Denis. They're searching for a man by the name of Angelo Bronte, an Italian strongman that the Braithwaites handed Jack Marston off to after kidnapping him. Bronte more or less runs the city from the shadows, and they're able to find him after asking around town and meeting some of his enforcers. Before long, Dutch, Arthur, and John Marston are walking up to the front gate of Angelo Bronte's mansion, and we see Dutch making yet another big mistake. He pulls the guard at the gate against the bars and demands to see Bronte. Then, upon being shown inside, he proceeds to act like he owns the place and starts demanding answers while standing at gunpoint. This is another example of his hubris, and I would even argue it shows that his ego is growing even more as the game goes along. Going back to Chapter 1, we can see where he started by ignoring Hosea when the older man warned him about Leviticus Cornwall. That instance involved him robbing a train that was owned by what was, to him, just the image of a rich and powerful man. It was risky, but the risk was at a distance, so to speak. Then he upped the ante by being willing to show his face in Valentine, knowing how big the bounty on his head was and ignoring the risk posed if someone identified him. Then he went a step further and even posed as law enforcement in Rhodes, basically pulling himself, in his mind, equal with the people who were after him and the gang. And now we see him brazenly walking into the home of a man who is above even law enforcement and making his demands as if he is some kind of king. This act, though, will be the beginning of the end of his rise as Bronte sees through him right away and begins playing him like a fiddle. It starts with Bronte convincing Dutch to send Arthur and John to stop some grave robbers in the cemetery. This mission is a setup, with some of Bronte's men playing the role of the grave robbers, and with the police being there within minutes of John and Arthur arriving. Now, I'll be honest here, when I say it's a setup, I don't have any firm evidence to back that up, and I'm going solely off what seems to make the most sense. Bronte knew Dutch and his boys were looking for him, and you can bet he had some informants scoping out the crew as they moved in the city. He might not have all the details, but he knows Dutch is an outlaw, and he knows he has a bigger gang situated somewhere. He wants to feel them out and see what they're made of so that he can get some use out of them before he disposes of them. And the best way to do that would be to lay out a test and see if they can pass it. He even knows it's been taken care of before John and Arthur return, and gives Jack to Dutch and sends them on their way, with the pair waiting outside as the men return. Anyone who takes a few minutes to really think about it would realize that nothing happens in Saint Denis without Bronte being informed. And if Dutch was as smart as he says he is, they would have left the area that night. But Bronte also knew the right buttons to push to get Dutch's attention, and within a few days, he, Arthur, Hosea, and Bill are attending a party at the mayor's house as Bronte's guests. Dutch thinks that he's the one with the upper hand, and even overlooks the underhanded insults thrown his way by Bronte while accepting an obviously bogus tip about the trolley station in the city having money, something they sorely needed. And that point might be worth talking about here, because with every new camp, Dutch keeps insisting they just need one big score, one big infusion of cash, and then they can achieve their goal of disappearing. Early on, he's still following the idea of moving back west, but by the time we get to Shady Belle, he's insisting they'll be heading for the island of Tahiti in the Pacific Ocean. In reality, he never had any plan to actually retire or get out of the life of crime that he's become accustomed to. The search and ever-growing need for money stems from the chase for excitement and the love of the game of cat and mouse that he's playing with the law. I say that because the reality is that he could have sent one of the lesser-known members of the gang, or even an unknown accomplice like Josiah Trelawney, back into Blackwater at any time to secure the money they'd stashed so they could escape back west after lying low for a short time. They also could have flown under the radar a little better in Valentine, focusing on legal means of making money while hunting and foraging for food until the heat from Blackwater died down. Either of those plans would likely have gone 1,000 times better than what wound up happening. And if Dutch actually cared about the gang as much as he says he does, and had even a small amount of the intelligence he claims to have, they wouldn't be walking into the mess they find at the trolley station in Saint Denis. And it is a mess, to be sure. The whole thing was a setup from the start, with the cash register and safe being basically empty, and the police swarming the spot within seconds of the robbery starting. Dutch finally realized they'd been set up by Bronte as he rode a trolley through the streets gunning down crooked police, but by then it was much too late. And from here, things only get worse, as Dutch decides he needs revenge on Bronte for the betrayal that he really should have seen coming. He claims they need to get rid of the strongman so they can more easily rob the bank in Saint Denis, as Bronte's men would only make things more difficult. But this plan has more holes than a block of Swiss cheese. For one thing, robbing the bank in the city is a really dumb idea with or without Bronte's presence. The heat on them is high enough, and they have made a big enough fuss in the area that the Pinkertons are sure to show up sooner rather than later. For another, taking out Bronte isn't going to take out his men or the corrupt officials he's been controlling. It's just going to make them mad or even more difficult to deal with as they start running a little more free without his restrictions. But at this point, they're in too deep for Dutch to really care or pull back. And they move full steam ahead, first kidnapping and killing Bronte, and then robbing the bank, which winds up being the first nail in the coffin as the Pinkertons show up to stop them. Hosea and Lenny are killed. John is captured, and most of the rest of them wind up stranded on an island after escaping the law on a boat, just like Dutch always wanted. Of course, the island isn't Tahiti, And they're still outlaws, as they find themselves in the middle of a proxy war with no way out but to fight alongside the resistance. They manage to make it back to America and even reunite with the gang, but by this point in the story, Dutch is so far gone that even his adopted sons don't recognize him. As the final chapter of the game unfolds, the mistakes pile up and the walls close in like a noose around Dutch's neck. He comes face to face with Leviticus Cornwall once more, killing the mogul in a moment that highlights just how far he spiraled, and he increasingly takes the advice of someone who's been in his ear for months but that I've refrained from talking about until now: Micah Bell. Micah Bell joined the gang a couple months before they got to Blackwater, and he's been a driving force behind a lot of the worst decisions we've seen Dutch make. It was his idea to rob the ferry in Blackwater. He was the one who set up the meeting between Colm O'Driscoll and Dutch that nearly cost Arthur his life. He pushed the idea of robbing both the Greys and the Braithwaites. He was the one encouraging Dutch to escalate things in Saint Denis. And as we walk into the final chapter, he is the one in Dutch's ear more than anyone else. His influence on Dutch wasn't always as strong as it is in Chapter 6, as the leader brushed off Micah's suggestion to go back and get the Blackwater money in the early part of the game. But as time has gone on, he's been able to gain Dutch's trust and counter people like Hosea and Arthur by playing into Dutch's power fantasy. And as Dutch becomes more mentally unstable later in the game, Micah's whispers spur him on to not only kill Cornwall, but to use the Wapiti Indian tribe that's been struggling to survive against a government incursion to their advantage by inciting violence and starting a war. Now, it's important to point out here that Micah's influence, as powerful as it may have been, wasn't the only thing bringing Dutch down, as he had plenty of moments where he made terrible decisions on his own that didn't make a lot of sense from a logical standpoint. One that jumps out was on the island of Guarma, where he strangled an old woman who was guiding them for reasons that were seemingly more in his head than reality. He told Arthur he did it because the woman was going to rat them out, but there wasn't really much that she could have done that they hadn't already managed to do on their own. Shortly after killing her, Dutch leads the charge to blow up a building and attack an army to save Javier. So unless she had some kind of magical connection that would have been able to rat them out before they could partake in that activity, there really wasn't much to fear. The gang falls apart quickly as the final chapter unfolds, and while there is a lot of action, there are really only a couple of things I want to focus on before we make the final determination on whether Dutch is a friend or a foe. The first big thing is how Dutch turns on everyone he used to trust and rely on, leaning more into Micah and his way of thinking as the final moments tick away. The first enormous instance we see of this happens at the Cornwall Kerosene and Tar Company near the end of the battle between Cornwall's men and the Wapiti warriors. Dutch and Arthur are fleeing the main building when Arthur is blinded and stunned by a steam burst from a pipe. He's knocked to the ground and several members of the army burst in, with one of them jumping on top of him and attempting to plunge a knife into his chest. As Arthur looks over to Dutch for help, Dutch backs away and flees, leaving Arthur to die at the hands of the army. Thankfully, Eaglefly shows up and saves him, but it's an important turning point because this was the first active decision that Dutch made to let someone he used to care about die. It could be argued that leaving John in prison a few missions prior was on par with this, but in that instance, John wasn't facing imminent death, and it could be argued that they were using him as bait. Only a couple missions later, Dutch goes even further by lying about John being killed during the final train robbery of the game, as he chose to leave the man behind rather than save him. As if betraying both of his supposed sons wasn't enough, he then makes the call to leave Abigail in the hands of Agent Milton after she's captured, and the gang's downfall is complete. After a showdown between Dutch, Micah, Arthur, a returning John who calls out Dutch for his betrayal, and the few remaining members of the gang, there is one final shootout with the Pinkertons, and we get the final glimpse of Dutch from Arthur's eyes as the man he once called a friend leaves him on a mountaintop to take his final breath. There is a moment in the epilogue involving Dutch as John tracks down Micah years later, but that doesn't really factor in much as far as we're concerned for the sake of this video. That being said, we now have the task of labeling Dutch as a friend or a foe. And while it seems like a rather easy discussion, he's actually one of the more difficult characters I've broken down to this point. For the first few chapters, he could almost be considered a friend as he does look out for the members of the gang and does his best to make sure they are taken care of even when he isn't. He makes some stupid decisions like robbing Cornwall's train, but his heart seems to be in the right place even if his mind isn't. There's a change that happens in him as we move from Rhodes to Saint Denis, and a massive change over the time they spend in Guarma and as they come back to the mainland. And that cannot be overlooked. He was always an outlaw, and in the time we get to spend with him, he seems really bad at making decisions that are going to be beneficial to the group overall. But after Guarma, he seems to be more malicious and even murderous at times, even when it comes to members of the gang. In the end, Dutch winds up falling into the foe category, and it could easily be argued that he was there from the beginning in some ways. There were hints at where he was heading when he chose not to go after Arthur when he was kidnapped by Colm's men, and the active decisions that he made along the way to put his ego above the well-being of the gang showed his true colors long before he broke down in chapters 5 and 6. I don't think he was always the same man we see in the games, as there are hints that he had good intentions and was even a good person at times in his past, despite the tendency to rob and murder people as an outlaw. And that's something that's worth noting as well, because being an outlaw doesn't make someone a bad person or even an outright foe for the sake of this series. People are much more complex than the black and white stance we sometimes take with them. It's easy to say that people who break the laws, don't follow social norms, or who bend ethics and morality are bad. But it takes a lot more to really dig into the nuance that comes with empathizing and understanding what it means to be human. We often bring our own experiences and prejudices into situations, and we tend to make snap judgments and stick to them when we really should be digesting all the facts and information before making up our minds about people. I could have easily boiled this video down into a 1-minute long short where I said something along the lines of, well, he robs and murders, so he's a foe. But that's irresponsible and immature, and it does a disservice to break any person or character into something that simple. As we go through life and try to make our way in the world, we should strive to think more critically about the people that we interact with and stop making everything black and white. I see it in headlines and social media posts all the time. People tend to want to simplify events and other people into good or evil, but it's never really that simple. Those concepts might work well for a child, but by the time we've made it into adolescence and adulthood, we should be taking more time to think critically and to recognize the nuance that exists in the world around us. The most important question we can ask ourselves is, would I want someone judging me as quickly as I am judging them? But now I want to know what you thought of my assessment of Dutch Van der Linde. Did I get it right by calling him a foe, or did I judge him too harshly? Let me know in the comments. If you liked the video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to Lost in Games here on YouTube so you don't miss any of the character breakdowns I have coming up, and so you don't miss out on the other big series I release weekly here on the channel, Philosophy and Ethics in Games. If you want to support the channel in other ways while getting cool perks like having your name on the screen, I have channel memberships, a Patreon, and a membership program on my website where you can check out some of the other projects I've got going on and keep up with everything I do in the future. That's all I've got for now. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.